War strips away everything we think we know about ourselves. It peels back the layers of civilization, education, and comfort until only the rawest essence of humanity remains. In the trenches of the Great War, men discovered truths about courage, fear, love, and sacrifice that no peacetime could ever teach. This is a story of one such discovery, a tale of how hope can bloom even in the most forsaken places, how brotherhood can transcend the boundaries of nation and creed, and how sometimes, against all odds, miracles do happen in the darkness. The rats were the worst part, Thomas Whitmore decided as he pressed his back against the muddy trench wall, listening to the familiar whistle of incoming artillery. Not the constant threat of death, not the stench of decay that hung over no man's land like a poisonous fog, not even the screams of the wounded in the night. It was the rats. They were everywhere, fat and bold, feeding on the endless supply of corpses that littered the battlefield between the British and German lines. He pulled his steel helmet lower over his eyes as dirt rained down from the explosion somewhere to his left. The bombardment had been going on for 3 hours now, part of what the officers called a softening up, before another doomed assault across the wasteland. Thomas had survived 4 such assaults in the past 2 months since arriving at the Somme. Each time, fewer men came back. "Whitmore," Sergeant McKinnon's gruff Scottish accent cut through the thunder of shells. "Get yourself to Lieutenant Morrison's dugout. On the double." Thomas grabbed his rifle and duck-walked through the communication trench, keeping his head below the parapet. The trenches formed a maze of muddy corridors carved into the French countryside, reinforced with wooden planks and sandbags that did little to keep out the persistent damp. Every few yards he passed huddled groups of soldiers, some cleaning their weapons with the mechanical precision of men who had nothing else to focus on. Others staring into space with the 1,000-yard stare he'd seen too often. Private Jenkins, barely 18 and still writing letters to his mother every day, looked up as Thomas passed. "Think they'll send us over the top again, Tommy?" Thomas paused, studying the boy's face. Jenkins had arrived just last week, full of patriotic fervor and talk of heroic charges. The reality of trench warfare had yet to fully sink in. "Just keep your head down and follow orders, lad." And the dugout that served as Morrison's command post was little more than a reinforced hole carved into the trench wall, covered with corrugated iron and sandbags. Thomas ducked through the low entrance, saluting as he straightened. Lieutenant Morrison looked up from a map spread across a makeshift table constructed from ammunition boxes. "Whitmore, good. I need you to take a message to Captain Harrison in C Company. The telephone lines are cut again, and this can't wait." Morrison handed him a sealed envelope. "Their position is about 200 yards down the front line, past the old German bunker we took last month." Thomas accepted the envelope, noting the weight of it. Whatever the message contained, it was important. "Any particular route, sir?" "Stick to the communication trenches as much as possible. Jerry's been active with the snipers today." Morrison's weathered face showed the strain of command. At 25, he looked 40. "And Whitmore, if you don't make it through, destroy the message. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Thomas made his way back into the trench system, tucking the envelope securely in his breast pocket. The communication trenches zigzagged back and forth to prevent enemy fire from enfilading the entire length, but they also made navigation confusing, especially during bombardments when landmarks disappeared under shell explosions. He had been walking for 10 minutes when the world exploded. The shell hit directly above him, collapsing a section of the trench and burying him under tons of mud, wooden planks, and debris. Thomas felt the crushing weight press down on his chest as darkness closed in. His last coherent thought before unconsciousness was that he had failed his mission. When awareness returned, it came with pain. His left leg throbbed with each heartbeat, and his mouth was full of dirt. Thomas tried to move and realized he was trapped, his body pinned under a heavy beam. Panic seized him until he forced himself to think clearly. He could breathe, which meant there was an air pocket. He could move his right arm, which meant he wasn't completely buried. Working methodically, he began to dig, using his free hand to scoop away dirt and debris. The work was exhausting, and several times he had to rest when dizziness threatened to overwhelm him. Time became meaningless in the suffocating darkness. Minutes or hours might have passed when he finally created enough space to pull himself free. Thomas emerged from the collapsed trench to find himself in no man's land. The familiar landscape of the Western Front stretched before him, a moonscape of shell craters, twisted wire, and the dark shapes of the dead. In the distance, he could see the flickering muzzle flashes of machine guns and the star shells that periodically illuminated the battlefield in ghostly white light. Behind him, the British trenches seemed impossibly far away. Ahead, the German lines looked equally distant. He checked his pocket for the message. Still there, though the envelope was torn and stained with mud. His rifle was lost somewhere in the collapsed trench, but he still had his pistol and bayonet. More importantly, he still had his mission. The night air carried the perpetual symphony of war, distant artillery, the crack of rifle shots, the occasional burst of machine gun fire. But here in the middle of no man's land, Thomas felt strangely isolated from it all, as if he had stepped outside the war itself and become an observer rather than a participant. He began to crawl toward what he hoped was the direction of the British lines, using shell craters for cover. The ground was treacherous, soft in places where recent rains had created mud pits that could swallow a man whole. In other spots, the earth was baked hard by explosions, creating a surface as unforgiving as concrete. A flare burst overhead, bathing the landscape in harsh white light. Thomas pressed himself into the bottom of a crater, counting the seconds until darkness returned. In that brief illumination, he had seen something that made his blood run cold. He was crawling in the wrong direction. The German trenches lay ahead, not behind. Disoriented by the explosion and his time underground, he had emerged facing the enemy lines. Worse, he was now closer to the German positions than to his own. Any attempt to turn back would require crossing the most dangerous part of no man's land, the killing ground, where both sides concentrated their fire. Thomas lay still, considering his options. He could wait for dawn and try to surrender, though there was no guarantee the Germans would accept it. He could attempt to reach the German lines and become a prisoner of war, or he could try to make his way back to the British trenches, risking almost certain death in the crossfire. As he weighed these grim alternatives, he heard something that changed everything, voices speaking German, very close by. Thomas held his breath, straining to listen. The voices were coming from a large shell crater about 20 yards to his left. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out the silhouettes of steel helmets above the crater's rim. A German patrol, probably cut off from their own lines by the bombardment. He counted at least 3 voices, maybe 4. They seemed to be having an argument about something, their words carried on the night wind. Thomas's grasp of German was limited to a few phrases learned from captured prisoners, but their tone suggested they were lost, just as he was. One of the Germans was wounded. Thomas could hear groans of pain between the whispered conversations. The patrol had probably been caught in the same bombardment that had buried him. Now they were trapped in no man's land, unable to return to their trenches without risking fire from British sentries. A crazy idea began to form in Thomas's mind. The message in his pocket was important enough that Lieutenant Morrison had risked a man's life to deliver it. If these Germans were also cut off, perhaps there was a way to use the situation to his advantage. Moving with infinite care, Thomas began to work his way closer to the German position. Every movement had to be calculated. A misplaced stone, a splash in a puddle, any sound could bring instant death from frightened men with weapons. It took him nearly an hour to cover the 20 yards. From his new position, he could see into the crater. 4 German soldiers huddled in the muddy depression, their uniforms torn and stained. One man sat propped against the crater wall, his left arm hanging useless at his side. The others were young, probably no older than Private Jenkins back in the British trenches. Thomas studied their positions, noting their weapons, 3 rifles and what appeared to be a machine pistol. One of the soldiers was standing watch while the others tended to their wounded comrade. They were disciplined, even in this desperate situation, maintaining military order despite their circumstances. As he watched, Thomas realized something that struck him with unexpected force. These were not the monsters that British propaganda portrayed. They were soldiers, like himself, caught in circumstances beyond their control. The wounded man was someone's son. The others had families waiting for them at home. In that moment, the abstract concept of the enemy became uncomfortably human. But they were still the enemy, and he still had his mission to complete. Thomas checked his pistol, ensuring a round was chambered. His plan was desperate, probably suicidal, but it might work. If he could create enough confusion, if he could convince them that surrender was their only option, he might be able to take them prisoner and use them to get back to the British lines. He was about to move when the sound of boots on muddy ground froze him in place. More voices, speaking English this time. A British patrol working its way across no man's land. Thomas's heart leaped with hope until he realized the danger. If the British patrol discovered the Germans, a firefight would erupt, and he would be caught in the middle. The British soldiers were moving carelessly, their voices carrying too far in the still night air. Thomas counted 3 men, possibly a reconnaissance patrol sent out to gather intelligence on German positions. They were heading directly toward the crater where the Germans waited. Thomas faced an impossible choice. He could warn the British patrol, alerting them to the German presence, but that would certainly result in a firefight that might kill them all. He could remain hidden and let events unfold naturally, but innocent men on both sides would die. Or he could try something unprecedented, something that violated every rule of warfare he had been taught. The British patrol was 50 yards away and closing. In the German crater, the soldiers had heard them coming. Thomas could see weapons being readied, bodies tensing for combat. In moments, men would start dying. Thomas made his decision. Standing slowly, he raised his hands above his head and stepped into the open ground between the 2 groups. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly in the night air. "Don't shoot! British soldier here!" Both patrols froze, weapons trained on the figure that had appeared seemingly from nowhere. Thomas found himself in the surreal position of standing in no man's land with enemies on one side and allies on the other, all pointing guns at him. "Who goes there?" The challenge came from the British patrol, their leader's voice tight with suspicion. "Private Thomas Whitmore, 2nd Battalion, West Yorkshire Regiment," Thomas called back, his hands still raised. "I've got wounded Germans in a shell crater here. They're cut off, same as we are." A moment of stunned silence greeted this announcement. The concept of a British soldier protecting German enemies was so alien that both sides seemed unable to process it immediately. "Are you mad, Whitmore?" The British patrol leader's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Step aside and let us finish them." "Can't do that, Corporal," Thomas replied, recognizing the voice now. Corporal Davies from B Company, a decent man with a wife and children back in Yorkshire. "They've got wounded. They're not fighting." From the German crater came a voice speaking accented English. "British soldier, why do you help us?" Thomas turned slightly toward the crater, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Because this isn't about helping you. It's about staying human in an inhuman situation." The standoff stretched on, tension thick enough to cut. Thomas could feel the weight of decisions being made around him, men calculating angles of fire and considering their options. At any moment, someone might decide that the strange British soldier had lost his mind and needed to be eliminated along with the enemy. "Davies," Thomas called to the British patrol leader. "I've got a message for Captain Harrison, important enough that Morrison sent me out in this bombardment. Help me get these Germans back to our lines as prisoners, and we all get out of this alive." Prisoners? Davies' voice suggested. He thought Thomas had indeed lost his mind. "We can't take prisoners back across no man's land. Command would have our heads." "Command wants intelligence about German positions," Thomas countered. "These men have been in the German trenches. They know things we need to know." It was a desperate argument, but it carried enough logic to give Davies pause. Intelligence was always valuable, and prisoners who could provide information about enemy dispositions were worth more alive than dead. From the German crater, the voice spoke again. "We surrender to the British soldier who shows a mercy. We trust his word." Thomas felt the weight of that trust settle on his shoulders. These enemy soldiers were placing their lives in his hands, believing that his promise of safety meant something. The responsibility was staggering. "Whitmore," Davies called out, "you're putting us all at risk with this madness." "We're already at risk, Corporal. Every second we stand here arguing increases our chances of being spotted by snipers or caught in another bombardment." Thomas kept his voice steady, projecting a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Help me get these men back to our lines. Let the officers sort it out from there." The decision hung in the balance for what felt like eternity. Thomas could hear the distant rumble of artillery, the crack of rifles from the trenches on both sides, the normal sounds of war continuing while this small drama played out in the darkness between the lines. Finally, Davies spoke. "All right, Whitmore, we'll try it your way. But if this goes wrong, it's on your head." Thomas felt a surge of relief, though he knew the most dangerous part was yet to come. Getting enemy prisoners safely back to British lines through no man's land would require extraordinary luck and careful planning. "Germans," he called toward the crater, "we're going to get you back to safety, but you need to follow orders exactly. Any wrong move, and someone gets nervous with a trigger finger." The response came immediately. "We understand. We follow your orders." What followed was perhaps the strangest military operation in the history of the war. Thomas coordinated between the British patrol and the German soldiers, working out a system of movement that would minimize the risk to all involved. The wounded German would be carried by his comrades, while the British patrol maintained security and guided them toward friendly lines. The journey across no man's land became a surreal exercise in cooperation between enemies. Davies' patrol moved with practiced stealth, while the German soldiers followed their every instruction with military precision. Thomas found himself serving as translator and mediator, helping both sides understand each other's needs and concerns. They moved from crater to crater, using the torn landscape for concealment. The wounded German, whose name Thomas learned was Heinrich, had taken shrapnel in his shoulder but remained conscious throughout the journey. His comrades, Karl, Friedrich, and a young soldier called Werner, supported him with gentle efficiency. As they progressed toward the British lines, Thomas found himself in conversations with the German soldiers that would have been impossible under any other circumstances. Karl, the senior NCO among them, spoke reasonable English learned from a British governess before the war. Through him, Thomas began to understand that these men were as tired of the fighting as any British soldier, as eager to return home to their families. "Why did you help us?" Karl asked during one of their rest stops in a large shell crater. "We are your enemies." Thomas considered the question carefully. "I don't know if I can explain it properly, but when I saw you there, wounded and lost like we were, you didn't look like enemies. You looked like soldiers trying to survive, same as us." Karl translated for his comrades, and Thomas saw nods of understanding. Werner, the youngest, said something in German that made the others smile sadly. "What did he say?" Thomas asked. "He says his mother told him that war makes enemies of people who should be friends," Karl replied. "Perhaps she was right." The observation stayed with Thomas as they continued their careful journey. Here in no man's land, removed from the structure and ideology of their respective armies, these men were simply human beings, helping each other survive. It was a profound realization that challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of warfare and enemy. They were within 100 yards of the British trenches when disaster struck. A German star shell burst overhead, illuminating their small group in harsh white light. Somewhere in the British trenches, a sentry spotted movement and opened fire. The crack of rifles split the night air, and bullets began snapping over their heads. "Down!" Davies shouted, and all 7 men dove for the nearest crater. But they had been seen, and now both British and German positions were firing in their direction, each side assuming they were facing an enemy patrol. Thomas found himself in the nightmare scenario he had feared, caught between 2 armies in a firefight, with men on both sides trying to kill him. "We've got to get to the British lines fast," Davies yelled over the gunfire, "before Jerry brings up machine guns." The wounded Heinrich was struggling now, his injured shoulder making movement difficult. Thomas realized that at their current pace, they would never make it to safety before being cut down by crossfire. "Karl," he shouted to the German NCO, "can your men run?" Karl assessed his soldiers quickly. "Heinrich cannot run. We will not leave him." Thomas felt the pieces of his desperate plan falling apart. They were pinned down by fire from both sides, unable to advance or retreat, and it was only a matter of time before heavier weapons joined the engagement. In minutes, they would all be dead. That was when Thomas made the second crucial decision of the night. Standing up in full view of both armies, he began waving his helmet above his head and shouting at the top of his lungs, "Cease fire! British soldiers with prisoners! Cease fire!" It was an act of either supreme courage or complete madness. Thomas made himself a target for every rifle on both sides of no man's land, trusting that someone would recognize his uniform and accent before pulling the trigger. The firing slackened, then stopped altogether. In the sudden silence, Thomas's voice carried clearly across the battlefield. "British patrol returning with German prisoners. Hold your fire." A voice from the British trenches called back, "Identify yourselves." Private Whitmore, Corporal Davies, and Private Johnson with 4 German prisoners, Thomas shouted, hoping his improvised count was close enough to satisfy the sentries. After a tense moment, the response came, "Advance slowly, with your hands visible." What followed was the most nerve-wracking walk of Thomas's life. The small group moved across the final stretch of no man's land in full view of dozens of British rifles, any one of which could end their lives if a nervous sentry misidentified them as a threat. They reached the British wire as the first hints of dawn appeared in the eastern sky. Hands reached out to help them over the parapet and down into the safety of the trenches. Thomas felt his legs nearly give out with relief as he touched the duckboards of the front line trench. The German prisoners were immediately surrounded by curious British soldiers, many of whom had never seen a living enemy soldier up close. Thomas was struck by how young they all looked, British and German alike. Boys playing at a man's game with deadly, serious consequences. Lieutenant Morrison appeared, summoned by the commotion. His expression shifted from confusion to amazement as Thomas handed over the message he had carried through the night's adventure. "Whitmore, what in God's name happened out there?" Thomas gave a brief account of the night's events, his burial in the collapsed trench, emerging in no man's land, discovering the German patrol, and the decision to bring them back as prisoners. Morrison listened with growing astonishment. "You realize this is completely irregular, Private? Taking enemy prisoners in no man's land, bringing them back through our lines. There are protocols for this sort of thing." "Yes, sir. But the situation was irregular too, sir." Morrison studied the German prisoners, who stood at attention despite their exhausted condition. Karl, as the senior NCO, had assumed responsibility for his men and maintained military discipline even in captivity. "The wounded man needs a medical attention," Morrison observed. Yes, sir. They all fought bravely. They deserve to be treated properly. Morrison's expression softened slightly. Very well. We'll send them back to division for interrogation. And Whitmore, you'll be coming too. Command will want to hear your story in detail. As the German prisoners were led away to receive medical attention and await transport to the rear, Carl approached Thomas one final time. "Thank you," he said simply. "You saved our lives when you could have let us die. I will not forget this." Thomas shook the German NCO's hand, an action that drew stares from other British soldiers. "Take care of yourself, Carl. Maybe when this war ends, we can meet again under better circumstances." "Perhaps we will," Carl replied. "Perhaps we will." Thomas watched the German prisoners disappear into the communication trench, escorted by British guards who would ensure their safety. The adventure was over, but its impact on his understanding of war and humanity would last forever. As he made his way back to his own section of the trench, Thomas reflected on the night's events. He had begun the evening as a simple message runner, a small cog in the vast machine of war. He was ending it as someone who had seen beyond the artificial boundaries of nationality and uniform to recognize the common humanity that connected all soldiers, regardless of which side they served. The war would continue. The trenches would claim more lives. The artillery would keep thundering, and young men would keep dying in the mud of no man's land. But for one night, in one small corner of that vast conflict, enemies had become allies, and the rules of warfare had been temporarily suspended in favor of something more fundamental: the recognition that every soldier, British or German, was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's hope for the future. Private Jenkins was waiting when Thomas returned to his position, his young face bright with curiosity. "Tommy, we heard you brought back prisoners. What was it like out there?" Thomas settled against the trench wall, exhaustion finally catching up with him. How could he explain the complexity of what had happened? How could he describe the moment when enemies became human beings, when the war's simple narrative of good versus evil had dissolved into something more nuanced and difficult? "It was different than I expected, lad," he said finally. "Different than anything they told us it would be." Jenkins waited for more, but Thomas closed his eyes and tried to rest. The message had been delivered. The prisoners were safe, and he had survived another night in hell. But more than that, he had discovered something about himself and about war that would change him forever. In the distance, the artillery began its morning bombardment, and the cycle of violence continued. But Thomas carried with him the memory of Karl's handshake, of Werner's nervous smile, of Heinrich's quiet courage despite his wound. They were small things, human moments in an inhuman conflict, but they mattered more than all the grand strategies and patriotic speeches that had brought them to this place. The war would end eventually. Thomas was sure of that now, though he couldn't say when or how. When it did, men like Karl and Werner would return to their families, and boys like Jenkins would grow up in a world shaped by what they had experienced in these trenches. What kind of world that would be depended, perhaps, on whether enough soldiers could see past the uniforms and remember the humanity of their enemies. As the sun climbed higher, bringing another day of heat and flies and the constant threat of death, Thomas Whitmore closed his eyes and dreamed of a time when German NCOs and British privates might meet as friends instead of enemies, when the lessons learned in the darkness of no man's land might help build a better future. The dream seemed impossible, as distant as the stars that had watched over their strange journey through the night. But then again, what they had accomplished in the darkness between the lines had seemed impossible too, and it had happened. Perhaps there was reason for hope after all. 3 days later, Thomas found himself standing at attention in a tent behind the lines, facing a panel of senior officers who seemed less than pleased with his unorthodox prisoner-taking expedition. Major General Hawthorne, commanding the division, sat behind a field desk covered with maps and reports, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had seen too much war and too little sense. "Private Whitmore," the general began, his voice carrying the clipped authority of the professional military class, "your actions in no man's land have created quite a stir. On one hand, you provided us with valuable intelligence from your German prisoners. On the other hand, you violated several standing orders regarding contact with the enemy." Thomas kept his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the general's head, as military protocol demanded. The interrogation of Karl and his men had indeed yielded useful information about German trench dispositions and the locations of machine gun nests that had been causing heavy casualties during recent attacks. But he sensed that the intelligence value of his mission was not the primary concern of these officers. "Furthermore," Major General Hawthorne continued, "there are reports that you were seen shaking hands with enemy soldiers. This kind of fraternization is strictly forbidden and sets a dangerous precedent for other men in the ranks." Colonel Pemberton, the divisional intelligence officer, leaned forward. "The prisoners spoke very highly of you during their questioning, Whitmore. Apparently, you made quite an impression on them. They seemed to think you were some sort of humanitarian crusader rather than a British soldier." Thomas felt heat rising in his cheeks, but maintained his military bearing. "Sir, I was following my orders to deliver the message. The situation with the German patrol was unexpected. I made the decision I thought would best serve our objectives while preserving British lives." "Your objectives?" General Hawthorne's eyebrows rose. "Private, your objective was to deliver a message, not to negotiate prisoner exchanges in no man's land. What you did was unprecedented and could have resulted in a serious breach of security." Captain Morrison, who had been summoned to testify about the importance of the message Thomas had carried, spoke up from his position to the side. "Sir, if I may, Private Whitmore did complete his mission. The message was delivered intact, despite extraordinary circumstances, and the intelligence gained from the prisoners has already proven valuable in planning our next offensive operations." The general's expression suggested he was not entirely convinced by this defense. "Captain Morrison, that may be true, but military discipline depends on soldiers following orders, not improvising their own diplomatic solutions to tactical problems." Thomas realized his military career might be ending in this tent. He had expected praise for his ingenuity and courage, perhaps even a commendation for bringing back valuable prisoners. Instead, he was being treated like a potential traitor who had consorted with the enemy. "Private Whitmore," Colonel Pemberton said, consulting a folder before him. "The German NCO, this Karl Richter, made some interesting statements during his interrogation. He claimed that you told him the war was not about nation against nation, but about staying human in an inhuman situation. Did you make such a statement?" The tent fell silent, except for the distant rumble of artillery. Thomas weighed his options carefully. He could deny the statement, claim it was a misunderstanding or a deliberate lie by the prisoner, or he could stand by his words and accept the consequences. "Yes, sir, I said something along those lines." General Hawthorne's face darkened. "Private, such statements border on sedition. They suggest a lack of commitment to our cause and could be interpreted as giving aid and comfort to the enemy." "Sir, with respect, helping wounded enemy soldiers surrender is not giving aid and comfort to the enemy. It's following the rules of war as I understand them." "The rules of war, Private, are determined by superior officers, not by individual soldiers making field decisions based on personal philosophy." The general's voice carried a note of finality. "However, given the intelligence value of your mission and Captain Morrison's testimony about your previous service record, I'm prepared to be lenient." Thomas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, though he remained at attention. "You will be transferred to a new unit," General Hawthorne continued, "away from your current company, where this incident might inspire similar creative interpretations of orders. You'll be assigned to the 1st Battalion, Durham Light Infantry, which is being prepared for the next phase of operations on the Somme. Consider yourself fortunate that you're not facing a court-martial. The dismissal came with a warning that any future incidents of unauthorized fraternization with enemy forces would result in severe disciplinary action. Thomas saluted and left the tent with mixed feelings. He had avoided serious punishment, but he was being separated from the men he had served with for months, the soldiers who had become his brothers in the hellish crucible of trench warfare. As he walked back toward the front lines to collect his kit, Thomas reflected on the strange position he now found himself in. His superiors saw his actions as dangerous insubordination, while the German prisoners had viewed him as some sort of savior. The truth, he thought, lay somewhere between these extremes. He had simply been a soldier trying to do his duty while maintaining his humanity in an environment designed to destroy both. The Durham Light Infantry turned out to be a veteran unit with a reputation for aggressive patrolling and innovative tactics. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Ashworth, was a regular Army officer who had survived the first 2 years of the war through a combination of tactical skill and careful attention to the welfare of his men. Thomas was assigned to D Company under Captain Richard Thornley, a former schoolmaster from Newcastle who had earned his commission through battlefield promotion after the original company commander was killed during the first day of the Somme offensive. Thornley had a reputation for being both demanding and fair, expecting absolute professionalism from his men while showing genuine concern for their welfare. "So you're the famous Private Whitmore," Captain Thornley said when Thomas reported to his new company, "the man who took prisoners in no man's land and lived to tell about it." "Yes, sir, though I'm not sure how famous I want to be for it." Thornley smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Thomas had encountered from an officer since his adventure. "Don't worry, Private. In this company, we judge men by their actions under fire, not by what staff officers think of their initiative. Tell me, what did you learn from your German prisoners?" Thomas was surprised by the question. He had expected to be treated as a troublemaker who needed careful watching, not as a source of tactical intelligence. "They were professional soldiers, sir. Well-trained and disciplined, but tired of the war. Their morale seemed lower than ours, but their fighting capability was still high." "Interesting. What about their equipment and tactics?" "They were carrying the new model rifles, sir, and their uniforms were in better condition than I expected. The wounded man mentioned that they had been receiving regular supplies despite our efforts to disrupt their lines of communication." Thornley nodded thoughtfully. "That confirms what we've been seeing in other sectors. The German army is still a formidable fighting force, despite what the newspapers back home might say about them being on the verge of collapse." Over the following weeks, Thomas settled into the routine of his new unit. The Durham Light Infantry had developed a more flexible approach to trench warfare than many British formations, emphasizing small unit tactics and aggressive patrolling, rather than the rigid adherence to linear defense that had characterized much of the British effort on the Western Front. Captain Thornley believed in thorough preparation and detailed planning, but he also encouraged his NCOs and experienced privates to use their initiative when circumstances required it. Thomas found this approach refreshing after months of serving under officers who seemed to view any deviation from established procedure as a form of military heresy. The company's sector was a relatively quiet part of the line, where both sides seemed content to maintain a defensive posture while preparing for the next major offensive. This gave Thomas an opportunity to observe the daily routine of trench warfare from a new perspective, seeing how different units adapted to the unique challenges of their particular situation. The Durham men had developed an elaborate system of tunnels and deep dugouts that provided better protection than the shallow trenches Thomas had known with his previous unit. They had also established a network of listening posts and observation points that gave them superior intelligence about German activities in their sector. What impressed Thomas most was the company's approach to casualties. Rather than accepting losses as an inevitable cost of holding the line, Captain Thornley and his sergeants had implemented procedures that significantly reduced the number of men lost to snipers, artillery, and disease. Small changes, improved drainage, better camouflage, more frequent rotation of sentry duties, had a cumulative effect that made D Company one of the most effective units in the battalion. It was during his third week with the Durham Light Infantry that Thomas encountered something that would change his perspective on the war once again. He was on patrol duty in a forward listening post when he heard voices speaking German in no man's land. At first, he assumed it was another enemy patrol, but as he listened more carefully, he realized something was wrong. The voices sounded distressed, and he could hear what appeared to be someone calling for help. Thomas faced a familiar dilemma. Military protocol dictated that he should report the contact to his superiors and await orders. But the voices suggested that German soldiers were in trouble somewhere in the darkness between the lines, and every minute of delay might mean the difference between life and death. This time, however, Thomas decided to follow proper procedure. He sent a whispered message back to the company command post, reporting the contact and requesting instructions. The response came back within minutes. Investigate and report. Do not engage unless fired upon. With two other soldiers from his section, Thomas made his way carefully across no man's land toward the source of the voices. What they found challenged every assumption he had developed about the nature of warfare and the relationship between enemies on the battlefield. A German patrol had been caught in a shell crater by a random artillery bombardment. 2 men were dead, a third was badly wounded, and the fourth, a young soldier who could not have been more than 17, was trying desperately to help his injured comrade while avoiding detection by British sentries. The wounded German was unconscious, his leg nearly severed by shrapnel. Without immediate medical attention, he would bleed to death within hours. The young soldier caring for him was using his own field dressings and clothing to try to stop the bleeding, but he lacked the supplies and knowledge to deal with such a severe wound. Thomas found himself staring at a scene that encapsulated the fundamental absurdity of the war. Here were enemy soldiers, dying in a shell crater between the lines, while British and German armies continued their deadly game of position warfare around them. The wounded man would die not because of enemy action, but because the arbitrary boundaries of military engagement prevented anyone from providing the help he needed. "What do we do, Tommy?" whispered Private Harrison, one of the soldiers who had accompanied Thomas on the patrol. Thomas studied the situation carefully. The young German soldier was clearly exhausted and frightened, struggling to save his comrade's life with inadequate resources. He posed no immediate threat, but he was still technically an enemy combatant in a war zone. "Heinrich, can you hear me?" The young German was speaking to his wounded friend in a voice filled with desperation. "Stay with me. Help is coming." But no help was coming. German patrols would not search no man's land during daylight hours, and by nightfall, the wounded man would be dead. The young soldier would either die with his friend or be forced to abandon him and try to make it back to his own lines alone. Thomas made his decision. "Stay here and cover me," he told Harrison and the other soldier. "If anything goes wrong, fall back to our lines and report what happened." Thomas stood up and walked slowly toward the German position, his hands visible and empty of weapons. The young German soldier saw him coming and reached for his rifle, but Thomas called out softly in the few words of German he had learned from his earlier encounter. "Kamerad, British soldier, help." The young German hesitated, his rifle halfway to his shoulder. Thomas continued walking slowly, repeating the words that seemed to have some magical power to suspend the normal rules of warfare. When he reached the crater, Thomas could see the full extent of the situation. The wounded German was unconscious but still breathing. His leg was badly mangled, but the bleeding had been slowed by the improvised bandages. With proper medical attention, he might survive. The young German soldier was staring at Thomas with a mixture of fear and hope. He said something in rapid German that Thomas didn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough. He was asking for help. Thomas knelt beside the wounded man and examined his injuries more carefully. The leg would need immediate surgery to save, but there was a chance if they could get him to a field hospital quickly. The question was whether a British medical unit would treat a German soldier, and whether the young German would trust Thomas enough to allow his wounded comrade to be taken into enemy hands. "Hospital," Thomas said, pointing toward the British lines. "Doctor, help." The young German understood but shook his head vigorously, pointing to his wounded friend and then toward the German trenches. He wanted to take his comrade back to his own medical facilities, but Thomas could see that the man would never survive the journey across the rough terrain of no man's land. Thomas tried a different approach. Taking out his own field dressing, he showed the German soldier how to apply pressure to a different part of the wound, demonstrating a technique he had learned from the company medic. Together, they were able to stop most of the bleeding and stabilize the wounded man's condition. As they worked, Thomas found himself studying the young German's face. He was perhaps 17 or 18 years old, with the pale complexion and soft features of someone who had grown up far from the harsh realities of industrial life. His uniform was clean and well-maintained, suggesting he was relatively new to frontline service. "Was ist dein name?" Thomas asked, using one of the German phrases he had picked up from interrogating prisoners. "Klaus," the young soldier replied. "Klaus Meller." "Und Sie?" "Thomas." "Thomas Whitmore!" It was a strange conversation conducted in a mixture of broken German, elementary English, and universal gestures. But somehow they were able to communicate the essential information. Klaus was from a small town near Munich. His wounded friend was named Wilhelm, and they had been together since joining the army 6 months earlier. This was their first time on the Western Front. As they talked, Thomas realized that Klaus reminded him strongly of Private Jenkins back with his old unit, young, idealistic, still believing that the war had some noble purpose that justified the suffering and death he was witnessing. It was heartbreaking to think that in a few months, if Klaus survived that long, the war would strip away his illusions and leave him as hollow-eyed and cynical as the veteran soldiers on both sides. Wilhelm began to regain consciousness, groaning with pain as awareness returned. Klaus spoke to him in soothing tones, explaining the situation and introducing Thomas as someone who was trying to help. Wilhelm's eyes widened when he realized he was being treated by an enemy soldier, but he seemed too weak to protest. Thomas made a decision that would have seemed impossible a few months earlier. Taking out his field message pad, he wrote a brief note in English explaining the situation and requesting immediate medical assistance for wounded soldiers in no man's land. He handed the note to Private Harrison and told him to take it back to Captain Thornley as quickly as possible. "What are you doing, Tommy?" Harrison asked, clearly confused by the request. "Getting help for wounded men," Thomas replied. "The captain will understand." Harrison disappeared into the darkness, leaving Thomas alone with Klaus and Wilhelm in the shell crater. It was a profound act of trust. Thomas was betting his life that Captain Thornley would respond with medical assistance, rather than a punitive expedition to arrest him for unauthorized fraternization with the enemy. While they waited, Thomas and Klaus worked together to make Wilhelm as comfortable as possible. They had no morphine to ease his pain, but Thomas showed Klaus how to fashion a splint from rifle stocks and field equipment that would help stabilize the injured leg during transport. The work gave them something to focus on besides the surreal nature of their situation. Here they were, two enemy soldiers collaborating to save a life in the middle of a battlefield where their respective armies were trying to kill each other. It was a perfect example of the contradiction that Thomas had been struggling to understand since his first encounter with German prisoners. The war demanded that they hate each other as enemies, but their common humanity insisted that they help each other as fellow human beings. Wilhelm's condition stabilized as the improvised medical care took effect, but he remained very weak and would need professional medical attention soon if he was going to survive. Klaus stayed close to his friend, talking to him constantly and trying to keep him conscious and alert. He speaks of his sweetheart, Klaus explained to Thomas, during one of Wilhelm's more lucid moments, a girl named Anna, who lives in his village. They plan to marry when the war ends. Thomas felt a familiar pang of recognition. How many soldiers on both sides carried similar dreams, hoping to survive long enough to return to the girls they had left behind? The war had become a vast machine for destroying such simple human hopes, turning young men's dreams of love and family into crosses in military cemeteries. "Do you have a sweetheart, Klaus?" Thomas asked. The young German nodded, pulling a small photograph from his breast pocket. It showed a pretty girl with blonde hair and a shy smile, standing in front of what appeared to be a country church. "Greta," Klaus said, "we were, how do you say, engaged before I came to the war." Thomas studied the photograph, thinking about the millions of similar pictures carried by soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Each one represented someone waiting at home, hoping for letters, dreading the arrival of official telegrams bearing news of death or wounds. "She's very pretty," Thomas said, handing the photograph back. "I hope you get to see her again soon." Klaus tucked the picture carefully back into his pocket. "And you? Do you have a girl waiting at home?" Thomas shook his head. No, sweetheart. Just my mother and sister in Yorkshire." It was getting close to dawn, and Thomas was beginning to worry about the response to his request for medical assistance. If Captain Thornley decided that the situation was too irregular to handle through official channels, Thomas might find himself facing another court-martial, this time for a more serious offense. His worries proved unfounded when Private Harrison returned with two medics and a stretcher, accompanied by Sergeant Mackenzie, the company's senior NCO. Thomas was relieved to see that they had brought medical supplies rather than weapons. "Bloody hell, Whitmore," Sergeant Mackenzie said as he surveyed the scene in the crater. "You've done it again, haven't you?" The medics immediately went to work on Wilhelm, applying proper field dressings and giving him a shot of morphine for the pain. Their professional assessment confirmed Thomas's amateur diagnosis. The wounded German would survive if he received immediate surgery, but he would lose the leg below the knee. Klaus watched anxiously as the British medics worked on his friend. He had accepted that Wilhelm would be taken to a British hospital, but Thomas could see that he was struggling with the decision to trust enemy soldiers with his comrade's life. "He will be treated properly," Thomas assured Klaus. "British doctors don't distinguish between German and British patients when it comes to saving lives." Klaus nodded, though Thomas wasn't sure he entirely believed the reassurance. The reality was that German prisoners often did receive adequate medical care in British hospitals, but there were also cases where wounded enemies received lower priority treatment than Allied soldiers. As the medics prepared to evacuate Wilhelm, Klaus faced another difficult decision. Military protocol required that he return to his own lines to report the incident and the loss of his patrol. But doing so would mean abandoning Wilhelm to the uncertain mercy of enemy captors. Thomas made a suggestion that surprised everyone present. "Klaus, you could come with us. Your friend will need someone he trusts nearby while he recovers. You could be with him in the hospital." Sergeant Mackenzie looked at Thomas as if he had lost his mind. "Whitmore, we can't just invite enemy soldiers to waltz into our rear areas. There are procedures for handling prisoners of war. Then let's follow the procedures, Thomas replied. Klaus can surrender formally, and we'll process him as a prisoner. That way, he stays with Wilhelm and gets proper treatment according to the Geneva Convention. It was another unprecedented situation, but one that seemed to make sense given the circumstances. Klaus considered the proposal carefully, weighing his loyalty to his army against his friendship with Wilhelm and his own chances of survival if he tried to return alone across no man's land. If I surrender, Klaus asked, will I be able to stay with Wilhelm in the hospital? I can't promise that, Sergeant Mackenzie replied honestly, but prisoner patients are often housed in the same medical facilities as our own wounded. You'd have a better chance of being near your friend than if you try to go back to your own lines. Klaus made his decision. Speaking formally in German, he surrendered his rifle and equipment to Sergeant Mackenzie, becoming an official prisoner of war of the British Army. It was a moment that struck Thomas as both significant and absurd. Here in a shell crater in no man's land, the formal procedures of military capture were being followed as if they were in a regimental orderly room rather than on a battlefield. The evacuation party made its way carefully back across no man's land, carrying Wilhelm on the stretcher while Klaus walked alongside under guard. Thomas brought up the rear, still somewhat stunned by how quickly the situation had developed and how readily his fellow soldiers had accepted his latest unorthodox decision. As they reached the British trenches, Thomas realized that he had once again found himself in the position of facilitating cooperation between enemies. It seemed to be becoming a pattern in his military service, though he wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a potential disaster waiting to happen. Captain Thornley was waiting when they reached the command post, having been awakened by the reports of Thomas's latest adventure. His expression was difficult to read as he surveyed the small procession of soldiers, medics, and prisoners. "Private Whitmore," he said finally, "I'm beginning to think that you have a talent for finding unusual situations in no man's land." "It seems that way, sir, though I don't go looking for them deliberately." "No, I don't suppose you do." Captain Thornley studied Klaus, who stood at attention despite his status as a prisoner. "This young man is the German soldier you encountered?" "Yes, sir. Private Klaus Müller. He was trying to save his wounded friend when we found them." Captain Thornley addressed Klaus directly in fluent German, asking him about his unit and the circumstances that had led to his capture. Klaus answered honestly, providing information about his patrol and the shell explosion that had killed 2 of his comrades. "He seems like a decent young man," Captain Thornley observed to Thomas. "Rather reminds me of some of our own recruits." It was a comment that reflected the growing awareness among veteran soldiers that their enemies were not fundamentally different from themselves. The propaganda that portrayed Germans as inhuman monsters became difficult to maintain when faced with young soldiers like Klaus, who clearly shared the same hopes, fears, and basic decency as British recruits of the same age. The bureaucratic machinery of prisoner processing began immediately, with Klaus being officially registered and prepared for transport to a prisoner of war camp. But first, he would be allowed to accompany Wilhelm to the field hospital, where both men would receive medical attention before being separated according to military regulations. As Thomas watched the young German soldier being led away, he reflected on the strange turns his military service had taken since that first night in no man's land. He seemed to have developed a reputation as someone who could navigate the complex human relationships that existed beneath the surface of the war's official narrative. It was a reputation that would soon bring him to the attention of officers whose plans would take him far from the familiar trenches of the Western Front, into situations where his unconventional approach to warfare would be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The reputation that followed Thomas through the ranks of the Durham Light Infantry proved to be both a blessing and a curse. Within weeks of the Klaus and Wilhelm incident, word had reached brigade headquarters about the private who seemed to have an unusual talent for managing encounters with German soldiers. It was a skill that would soon be put to a far more dangerous test than anything he had yet experienced. Captain Thornley called him to the command dugout on a gray October morning when the autumn rains had turned the trenches into rivers of glutinous mud that seemed to swallow men whole. The captain's expression was unreadable as he studied a set of orders that had arrived with the dawn dispatch. "Whitmore, you're being temporarily detached from D Company for a special assignment. Report to Major Blackwood at Brigade Intelligence immediately." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Special assignments in this war usually meant increased chances of not returning, and Brigade Intelligence suggested something far more complex than routine patrol duties. "What kind of assignment, sir?" "The kind where asking questions isn't encouraged, Private. Pack your kit and report within the hour." Major Blackwood turned out to be a lean, sharp-eyed officer with the bearing of a man who had spent years in the shadowy world of military intelligence. His dugout was located well behind the front lines in a communication trench that had been expanded into a maze of interconnected chambers housing the brigade's administrative functions. "Private Whitmore," Blackwood began without preamble, "your recent adventures in no man's land have created quite a stir in certain circles. It seems you have a gift for establishing rapport with German soldiers under unusual circumstances." Thomas remained silent, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere he might not want to go. "We have a situation developing that requires someone with your particular talents. German morale in this sector appears to be deteriorating more rapidly than we initially estimated. We're seeing increased numbers of deserters, more frequent attempts at individual surrender, and reports of growing dissatisfaction among their junior officers." Blackwood spread a map across his field desk, pointing to a section of the German lines about a mile north of their current position. "Intelligence suggests that a significant German unit is planning a mass surrender, but they're afraid to approach our lines directly. They fear being shot by their own officers or mistaken for an attack by our sentries. They need an intermediary, someone they trust to facilitate the process." Thomas began to understand why he had been summoned. "You want me to make contact with them, sir?" "Precisely. Your reputation has spread among German prisoners. Word is that you're a British soldier who can be trusted to honor agreements made in no man's land. Several prisoners have specifically mentioned your name during interrogations." The implications were staggering. If a significant German unit was planning to surrender, it could provide crucial intelligence about enemy positions and plans. More importantly, it might save hundreds of lives on both sides by avoiding a costly battle. "What exactly would this involve, sir?" "You would cross into German-held territory, make contact with the unit in question, and arrange the details of their surrender. It's extremely dangerous, of course. If you're caught by German military police or officers loyal to their cause, you'll be shot as a spy. If our own forces mistake your mission, you could be killed by friendly fire." Thomas considered the proposal carefully. Everything about it violated the normal rules of warfare, but then again, everything about his war experience so far had been abnormal. "How do we know this isn't a trap, sir? A way to capture or kill someone the Germans see as a threat to their troop morale?" Blackwood smiled grimly. "We don't. That's why this mission is voluntary, and why I'm not ordering you to accept it. But the potential intelligence value is enormous, and the lives it could save, both British and German, make it worth the risk." Thomas thought about Klaus and Wilhelm, about Karl and Heinrich from his first encounter. If their friends and comrades were looking for a way out of this nightmare, perhaps he could help them find it. "When would this happen, sir?" "Tonight. The German unit has indicated they'll have representatives in a specific section of no man's land after midnight. If you're going to do this, we need to move quickly before they lose their nerve or are discovered by their own command." Thomas made his decision with the same instinctive certainty that had guided him through his previous adventures. "I'll do it, sir." The preparation for the mission was unlike anything Thomas had experienced. Instead of standard infantry equipment, he was given civilian clothes that could pass for those worn by a French farmer, forged papers identifying him as a displaced person trying to return to his village, and a small amount of German currency that might be useful if he was captured. Most importantly, he was briefed on the recognition signals and passwords that would identify him to the German unit. The complexity of the arrangements suggested that this surrender attempt had been planned for weeks, involving elaborate communication through prisoner exchanges and coded messages. As night fell, Thomas made his way to the jumping-off point, a forward observation post that had been chosen for its proximity to the planned meeting site. Lieutenant Morrison, his former company commander, had been brought in to coordinate the operation from the British side. "Strange how things work out, isn't it, Whitmore?" Morrison observed as they waited for the signal to begin. "A few months ago, you were delivering routine messages. Now you're attempting to negotiate the surrender of an entire German company. It does seem rather unlikely, sir. Just remember, if this goes wrong, officially this mission never happened. We can't acknowledge sending anyone across the lines on this kind of operation. You'll be on your own." Thomas nodded, understanding the implications. If he was captured or killed, his family would be told he died in routine trench operations. There would be no recognition of the risks he was taking or the lives he might save. At 11:30, Thomas began his journey across no man's land for the third time, though this expedition was far more ambitious than his previous adventures. Instead of simply helping wounded soldiers or facilitating prisoner exchanges, he was attempting to arrange the surrender of an organized enemy unit, an act that could be seen as treason by the German High Command. The meeting point was a destroyed farmhouse that sat roughly halfway between the opposing trench lines. Before the war, it had probably been home to a French farming family who had fled when the armies arrived. Now it was a shell-scarred ruin that provided convenient cover for clandestine meetings. Thomas approached the farmhouse carefully, watching for signs of German sentries or patrols. The absence of recent shell craters suggested that both armies had tacitly agreed to avoid targeting this particular area, perhaps recognizing its value as neutral ground for prisoner exchanges and other irregular activities. He was 50 yards from the farmhouse when a voice called out softly in German, "Halt, identify yourself." Thomas responded with the agreed-upon recognition signal. "I am the British soldier who helped Wilhelm Braun and Klaus Müller." A figure emerged from the shadows, a German officer wearing the uniform of a lieutenant. He was older than Thomas had expected, probably in his 30s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years at war. "I am Lieutenant Ernst Weber," the German said in accented English. "You are Private Whitmore?" "Yes, sir." Weber studied Thomas carefully, as if trying to reconcile the legendary figure he had heard about with the ordinary-looking young soldier who stood before him. "My men have heard stories about you," Weber said finally. "They say you are a British soldier who understands that we are all human beings, caught in circumstances beyond our control." "I try to see things that way, sir." Weber gestured toward the farmhouse. "Come, there are others who wish to meet you." Inside the ruined building, Thomas found himself face to face with 6 German soldiers, 3 NCOs and 3 enlisted men, representing what Weber explained was a company of nearly 200 men who had decided they could no longer continue fighting. The senior NCO, a grizzled sergeant named Miller, no relation to Klaus, spoke for the group. His English was limited, but his message was clear. His unit was exhausted, demoralized, and ready to surrender if they could be assured of fair treatment. "We are not cowards," Muller explained through Weber's translation. "We have fought for 2 years. We have done our duty. But we can see that this war will not end with German victory. Why should we die for a lost cause? Thomas listened as the German soldiers explained their situation. Their company had been decimated by months of fighting on the Somme. Replacements were increasingly young and poorly trained. Supplies were irregular, and morale was collapsing as reports filtered back from Germany about food shortages and civil unrest. What they're proposing, Weber explained, is a coordinated surrender during tomorrow night's attack. British intelligence is correct. We have been ordered to assault your positions at dawn. Instead of attacking, my men will advance with white flags and surrender en masse. The plan was audacious and extremely dangerous. If German officers suspected the plot, Weber and his men would be shot for treason. If British forces misunderstood the surrender attempt, they might open fire on what appeared to be an attacking force. How many men are we talking about? Thomas asked. Approximately 180 soldiers, Weber replied, aimed at nearly a full company strength. Thomas realized he was being asked to coordinate the largest voluntary surrender in the history of the Western Front. The intelligence value would be enormous, but the risks were proportional to the potential benefits. What assurances do you need from the British command? First, that our surrender will be accepted and that we will not be shot during the approach. Second, that wounded men will receive medical attention regardless of nationality. Third, that we will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. These were reasonable demands, but Thomas wasn't sure he had the authority to make such commitments on behalf of the British Army. I can't make promises on behalf of my command, Thomas said carefully, but I can guarantee that I will personally ensure your message reaches the proper authorities and that your intentions are clearly understood. Weber and his men conferred in rapid German before reaching their decision. We trust you, Weber said finally. If you give your word that our surrender will be properly communicated, we will proceed with the plan. Thomas felt the enormous weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Nearly 200 lives, British and German, depended on his ability to convince his superiors to accept this unprecedented surrender and coordinate the necessary preparations. You have my word, Thomas said. I'll make sure everything is arranged properly. The return journey across no man's land was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of Thomas's life. He carried with him detailed information about German positions, troop strength, and planned operations, intelligence that would be invaluable to British commanders, but which would also make him an extremely high-value target if he was captured. Lieutenant Morrison was waiting when Thomas reached the British lines, having spent the hours since his departure coordinating with higher command about the potential surrender. How did it go? Morrison asked as Thomas dropped into the trench. They're serious about surrendering, sir. 180 men, including officers. They plan to do it during tomorrow morning's attack. Morrison's expression showed a mixture of excitement and concern. That's a significant number. Brigade is very interested, but they're also worried about the logistics, accepting that many prisoners during an active battle could be extremely complicated. Over the next several hours, Thomas found himself at the center of increasingly high-level discussions about the proposed surrender. Officers who would normally never speak to a private soldier were asking detailed questions about his conversations with Weber and the German soldiers. The main concern was tactical. If a German company failed to participate in the planned attack, it could create a gap in their lines that British forces could exploit. But it could also be a trap designed to draw British troops into a carefully prepared killing ground. Major Blackwood, who had initiated Thomas's involvement in the operation, was enthusiastic about the intelligence potential, but realistic about the risks. If this is genuine, he explained to the assembled officers, it could provide us with detailed information about German defensive positions and future operational plans. But if it's a deception, we could lose significant numbers of men to a well-planned ambush. The debate continued through the night. with messages flowing back and forth between frontline units and higher command. Thomas found himself repeatedly called upon to provide additional details about his conversations with the German soldiers and his assessment of their sincerity. As dawn approached, a decision was finally reached. The surrender would be accepted, but with elaborate precautions to protect British forces in case the operation was a trap. Thomas would return to no man's land during the attack to guide the surrendering Germans to safety and ensure that British troops understood what was happening. It was another unprecedented role for a private soldier, but Thomas had established himself as the only person both sides trusted to manage such a delicate operation. The German attack began at first light, preceded by a brief but intense artillery bombardment. Thomas positioned himself in a shell crater near the planned surrender point, watching as German soldiers emerged from their trenches and began advancing across no man's land. What he witnessed over the next hour would remain burned in his memory for the rest of his life. Weber's company advanced as planned, but instead of carrying rifles and attacking, they moved forward with white flags and their hands raised. The sight of nearly 200 enemy soldiers surrendering en masse was unlike anything seen on the Western Front. But not all of the German units had received word of the surrender plan. As Weber's men advanced with white flags, other German companies continued their attack, creating a confused battlefield where surrendering soldiers were mixed with attacking troops. British forces, uncertain about which Germans were surrendering and which were attacking, initially held their fire. But as the attacking German units pressed forward, defensive fire began, and soon the entire sector was engulfed in a fierce battle. Thomas found himself running across the battlefield, trying to guide surrendering German soldiers to safety while avoiding fire from both sides. It was chaos on a scale that defied comprehension, a battle where enemies and allies were intermixed, where surrender and attack were happening simultaneously, where the normal rules of warfare had completely broken down. Weber reached Thomas's position, bleeding from a wound in his arm but still conscious and trying to maintain control of his men. "Some of our units didn't receive the word," Weber gasped in English. "They're attacking as planned. My men are caught between your guns and theirs." Thomas realized they were trapped in the worst possible situation. Weber's company was being fired upon by British forces who couldn't distinguish them from attacking troops, while German units that were still fighting were treating the surrendering soldiers as traitors. "We need to get your men to the British lines quickly," Thomas shouted over the gunfire, "before this gets worse." What followed was perhaps the most chaotic retreat in military history. Thomas and Weber worked together to guide nearly 200 surrendering German soldiers across a battlefield where their own comrades were trying to kill them for desertion, while British forces were shooting at anything that moved. The journey to safety required every lesson Thomas had learned about movement in no man's land, combined with Weber's knowledge of German tactical procedures. They moved from crater to crater, using hand signals and shouted commands to coordinate the movement of large groups of men under fire. Some of Weber's soldiers didn't make it. Thomas watched helplessly as men who had been prepared to surrender peacefully were cut down by machine gun fire from positions that couldn't distinguish between attackers and prisoners. Others were killed by German artillery that targeted the retreating groups as deserters, but the majority survived, reaching British trenches in small groups throughout the morning. By noon, more than 160 German soldiers had successfully surrendered, providing British intelligence with the most comprehensive information about enemy positions and plans that had been gathered since the beginning of the Somme offensive. Thomas emerged from the ordeal covered in mud and blood, exhausted but alive. He had successfully coordinated the largest voluntary surrender on the Western Front, but the cost had been higher than anyone had anticipated. Weber, his wound treated by British medics, sought out Thomas as the surrendered soldiers were being processed. "Thank you," the German officer said simply. "You saved the lives of my men." "Not all of them," Thomas replied, thinking of the soldiers who had died during the chaotic retreat. "Enough of them, and perhaps their sacrifice will help end this war sooner." As Thomas watched Weber and his men being led away to prisoner processing stations, he reflected on how profoundly his understanding of warfare had changed since that first night in no man's land. What had begun as a simple message delivery had evolved into a series of encounters that challenged every assumption about enemies and allies, about duty and humanity, about the nature of war itself. But even as he celebrated the success of the surrender operation, Thomas sensed that greater challenges lay ahead. The war was entering a new phase, one where the traditional boundaries between combatants were becoming increasingly blurred, where survival would depend not just on military skill, but on the ability to navigate the complex human relationships that existed beneath the surface of organized violence. His reputation as a soldier who could bridge the gap between enemies had now reached the highest levels of command, and with that recognition would come opportunities and dangers that would test everything he had learned about war and humanity. The war was far from over, but Thomas Whitmore had found his place in it, not as a killer, but as someone who helped others remember their humanity in the midst of inhuman circumstances. It was a role that would soon bring him face to face with the ultimate test of his beliefs and his courage. The summons came on a bitter November morning, 3 weeks after the mass surrender operation that had made Thomas Whitmore's name whispered in command tents across the Western Front. This time, however, the messenger was not a company runner or even a staff officer, but a full colonel bearing the insignia of General Headquarters. "Private Whitmore, you're to report to Field Marshal Haig's command immediately. Full kit, ready for extended operations." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. Being summoned by the Commander-in-Chief of British forces in France was unprecedented for a private soldier. It suggested either the highest honor or the gravest danger, possibly both. The journey to GHQ took him far behind the lines, through communication zones where the industrial machinery of modern warfare was laid bare. Endless convoys of trucks carried ammunition and supplies forward, while ambulances brought the wounded back. Railway lines buzzed with activity as trainload after trainload of reinforcements moved toward the front. Field Marshal Haig's headquarters occupied a chateau that had once been the summer residence of French nobility. Now its elegant rooms housed the nerve center of the British war effort, where decisions affecting millions of lives were made daily. Thomas felt profoundly out of place as he was escorted through corridors lined with maps and staffed by officers whose uniforms bore more decorations than he had ever seen. The field marshal himself was a compact man with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to weigh everything they saw. He studied Thomas for a long moment before speaking, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Private Whitmore, your unconventional activities have created quite a stir. Some of my staff consider you a dangerous maverick who undermines military discipline. Others believe you represent a new approach to warfare that could save thousands of lives." Thomas remained at attention, uncertain whether he was about to be court-martialed or commended. Intelligence suggests that German morale is collapsing across multiple sectors. Your success in facilitating surrenders has convinced certain elements in their high command that negotiated capitulations might be preferable to futile resistance. However, there are also indications that German hardliners are planning a final offensive designed to inflict maximum casualties before any armistice can be arranged. The field marshal moved to a large map table covered with colored pins and marked positions. His finger traced a section of the front line north of their current sector. "We have received information through diplomatic channels that a significant German commander is prepared to surrender his entire division, nearly 8,000 men, if proper arrangements can be made. However, he fears that announcement of such intentions would result in his execution by military police loyal to the Kaiser." Thomas began to understand why he had been summoned. "Sir, you want me to make contact with this commander?" "More than that, Private. We want you to coordinate what could be the largest surrender in the history of warfare. But the mission involves crossing 60 miles of enemy territory, penetrating German command positions, and convincing a general to commit what his government would consider treason." The scope of the operation was staggering. Everything Thomas had done previously paled in comparison to what was being proposed. He would be operating entirely alone, deep behind enemy lines, with no support and no backup plan. "Sir, what makes you believe I can accomplish such a mission?" "Because, Private Whitmore, you have demonstrated something that our military colleges never taught us: the ability to see past uniforms and nationalism to the human beings underneath. German prisoners consistently speak of you as someone who can be trusted, someone who honors his word regardless of circumstances. That reputation has reached the highest levels of their command." Field Marshal Haig handed Thomas a sealed packet containing maps, recognition codes, and forged German identity papers. "The commander in question is General Friedrich von Steenberg, commanding the Wien-Etnie Reserve Corps. Intelligence indicates he is a career officer who believes the war is lost and wants to save his men from pointless slaughter. But he needs assurance that surrender will be accepted and that his troops will be treated according to international law." Thomas studied the materials, noting the incredible detail of the operation planning. Someone had spent weeks preparing for this mission, calculating routes, gathering intelligence, and establishing communication protocols. "When do I leave, sir?" "Tonight. A reconnaissance aircraft will drop you behind German lines approximately 20 miles from von Steinberg's headquarters. From there, you'll be on your own until the mission is complete, or—" The field marshal's voice trailed off, leaving the alternative unspoken. The preparation for the mission was unlike anything Thomas had experienced. Instead of military equipment, he was given civilian clothes appropriate to a German farmer, forged papers identifying him as a refugee, and enough German currency to maintain his cover for several days. More importantly, he received intensive briefing on German military hierarchy, recognition signals, and the specific protocols that would be required to approach General von Steinberg safely. The stakes were enormous. Success could save thousands of lives and potentially hasten the end of the war, while failure would almost certainly result in his execution as a spy. As night fell, Thomas found himself in a reconnaissance aircraft flying over German territory. The pilot, a young lieutenant with the casual fearlessness of the Royal Flying Corps, navigated by landmarks that were barely visible in the darkness below. "Drop zone coming up," the pilot called over the engine noise. "Remember, you've got one chance at this. I can't wait around if you're late to the rendezvous." Thomas checked his equipment one final time, ensuring that his forged papers were secure and his cover story firmly memorized. In 3 days, if everything went according to plan, he would meet the aircraft at a designated field for extraction. If he failed to appear, the pilot would assume he was dead or captured and return without him. The drop itself was terrifying and exhilarating. Thomas had never parachuted before, and the sensation of falling through darkness toward enemy territory tested every reserve of courage he possessed. But his landing was successful, and within minutes, he had buried his parachute and begun the long journey toward General von Steinberg's headquarters. The German rear areas were a revelation. Thomas had expected to find a war-torn wasteland similar to the British zones, but instead discovered relatively normal civilian life continuing despite the conflict. Villages showed signs of hardship. Food shortages were evident, and most young men were absent, but the infrastructure of daily existence remained intact. His cover as a refugee seeking to return to his family proved effective. German military police who stopped him at checkpoints accepted his forged papers without suspicion, and civilians he encountered offered assistance and directions. The contrast with the hellish landscape of the front lines was stark and unsettling. It took him 2 days of careful travel to reach the vicinity of von Steinberg's command post. The general had established his headquarters in a substantial farmhouse that provided both comfort and concealment from Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Getting close enough to make contact without being shot as an infiltrator required all of Thomas's accumulated experience in moving undetected through hostile territory. The breakthrough came when he observed the general's daily routine. Von Steinberg, despite his senior rank, maintained the habits of a frontline officer, personally inspecting positions and speaking directly with his subordinates. It was during one of these inspection tours that Thomas saw his opportunity. The general was examining defensive preparations at a forward artillery position when Thomas approached, still maintaining his refugee disguise. Speaking in careful German, he requested permission to speak privately with the commander about a matter of utmost importance. General Friedrich von Steinberg was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s whose uniform showed the wear of extended field service. His initial reaction to Thomas's approach was suspicion, but something in the young soldier's demeanor made him pause before summoning the guards. "You are not a German refugee," von Steinberg observed in accented English. "Your accent is wrong, and your bearing suggests military training. Who are you, and what do you want?" Thomas made the decision to abandon his cover and rely on the reputation that had brought him this far. "Sir, I am Private Thomas Whitmore of the British Army. I have been sent to discuss terms for the surrender of your command." The general's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol, but he did not draw the weapon. Around them, German soldiers continued their duties, unaware that an enemy agent was standing in their midst. "You are either very brave or completely insane," von Steinberg said finally. "Do you realize that I could have you shot immediately as a spy?" "Yes, sir, but I believe you are a man who values human life above military protocol. That's why I'm here." Von Steinberg studied Thomas carefully, noting the young soldier's calm demeanor and direct gaze. "You are the British soldier who has been facilitating surrenders. The one they call der Menschliche, the human one. I try to see soldiers as human beings first, enemies second, sir." The general gestured toward his staff car. "Walk with me. If you are who I believe you are, we have much to discuss." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary conversation of the entire war. As they drove through the German rear areas, General von Steinberg explained his position with brutal honesty. "This war is lost, Private Whitmore. Our lines are crumbling, our supplies are exhausted, and our men are dying for a cause that no longer has meaning. I have 8,000 soldiers under my command. Boys, most of them, who deserve to see their homes again. But German High Command would rather see them all die than admit defeat." Thomas listened as the general described the impossible situation facing German commanders who could see the futility of continued resistance but were bound by oath and military law to continue fighting. "What would be required for your command to surrender, sir?" "Assurance that my men would be treated properly, that wounded would receive medical attention, and that the surrender would be conducted with military honor rather than as a capitulation to criminals." These were reasonable demands, well within the parameters Thomas had been authorized to negotiate. But the logistics of accepting 8,000 prisoners simultaneously would strain British capabilities to the breaking point. "There is another consideration," von Steinberg continued. "My command includes several units that remain loyal to the Kaiser and would consider any surrender attempt to be treason. They would fight against their own comrades rather than submit to enemy forces." Thomas realized they were facing a more complex situation than anyone had anticipated. The German division was not uniformly committed to surrender. Internal conflict could result in a chaotic battle between German units, with British forces caught in the middle. "How many of your men support surrender, sir?" approximately 60% of my combat units, perhaps 70% of support personnel. But the loyalist units include our military police and several officer cadres who have threatened to execute anyone advocating capitulation. The mission was becoming exponentially more dangerous. Instead of coordinating a simple surrender, Thomas would need to help orchestrate what amounted to a civil war within the German division, with the added complexity of ensuring that British forces could distinguish between surrendering troops and those still fighting. That evening, concealed in the general's command bunker, Thomas participated in a clandestine meeting of German officers who supported surrender. The gathering was a profound testament to how thoroughly the war had broken the traditional bonds of military loyalty. Colonel Heinrich Weber, von Steinberg's chief of staff, outlined the tactical situation with professional precision. We estimate that loyalist forces number approximately 3,000 men, concentrated in defensive positions that command the approaches to our headquarters. They have declared their intention to fight to the death rather than surrender. Major Klaus Richter, the division's intelligence officer, added crucial information about enemy dispositions. Our communications intercepts indicate that German High Command suspects disloyalty in our sector. Military police units are being moved to our rear areas, possibly to prevent any surrender attempts. Thomas found himself in the surreal position of helping German officers plan operations against their own army. The moral complexity was staggering. These men were committing treason against their government in order to save the lives of their soldiers. We need to coordinate the surrender to occur before the military police arrive, von Steinberg concluded. But we also need assurance that British forces will accept such a large number of prisoners without confusion that could result in unnecessary casualties. Thomas had been provided with communication codes that would allow him to contact British headquarters, but using them would reveal his location to German intercept stations. The risk was enormous, but the potential benefits justified the danger. The signal was sent at midnight, a brief coded message indicating that the harvest was ready for collection. Within hours, the response arrived through the same clandestine channels. British forces were prepared to accept surrender of the entire German division, with medical facilities and prisoner processing stations being established to handle the unprecedented operation. But as dawn approached, disaster struck. A German military police battalion, acting on orders from High Command, surrounded von Steinberg's headquarters and demanded immediate surrender of all officers suspected of planning capitulation. The loyalist units within the division joined the military police, creating a force of nearly 4,000 men committed to preventing any surrender attempt. Thomas found himself trapped in the middle of a battle between German factions, with his own life hanging in the balance. Von Steinberg and his supporters were branded as traitors, while those loyal to the Kaiser prepared to fight their own comrades rather than allow surrender. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Military police stormed the command bunker, arresting officers suspected of surrender negotiations. Von Steinberg himself was taken into custody, along with most of his senior staff. Thomas managed to escape in the confusion, but he was now alone in enemy territory with his mission apparently failed. Worse, the internal German conflict had attracted the attention of British forces, who could see artillery flashes and hear gunfire from the German rear areas. Without understanding the situation, British commanders assumed they were witnessing a German offensive preparation and began their own bombardment of the area. Thomas found himself in the nightmare scenario of being caught between three different forces: German loyalists who would shoot him as an enemy spy, German surrenderists who could no longer protect him, and British artillery that was targeting his location without knowing he was there. The chaos reached its peak when German military police, searching for evidence of the surrender plot, discovered Thomas hiding in an abandoned farmhouse. His forged papers were scrutinized more carefully this time, and his true identity was quickly revealed. So, the military police commander said in perfect English, "You are the famous British agent who corrupts our soldiers with talk of surrender. You will be shot at dawn as a spy." Thomas spent what he assumed would be his final night in a makeshift prison, listening to the sounds of battle as German factions fought each other while British artillery pounded the entire area. His mission had not only failed, but had actually made the situation worse by triggering a civil war within the German division. But at dawn, instead of facing a firing squad, Thomas witnessed something unprecedented in the history of warfare. The soldiers assigned to execute him, young German conscripts who had been told he was an enemy spy, refused to carry out the order. Led by a sergeant named Muller, the same name Thomas realized with amazement as the NCO from his first prisoner encounter, they had decided that they would rather surrender than participate in further killing. "We know who you are," Muller explained to Thomas in broken English. "You are the soldier who helps wounded men, who sees enemies as human beings. We do not shoot such men." The mutiny spread rapidly through the German ranks. Soldiers who had been ordered to prevent surrender instead began surrendering themselves, often to Thomas personally, as the only British representative available. The military police found themselves outnumbered by their own troops, who had decided en masse that the war was over for them. Within hours, what had begun as a failed mission had transformed into something extraordinary. Not only was von Steinberg's original division surrendering, but units from adjacent sectors were also laying down their weapons. Word had spread through the German lines that the British agent who treated enemies with humanity was coordinating surrenders, and soldiers were abandoning their positions to reach him. Thomas found himself in the impossible situation of accepting the surrender of nearly 20,000 German soldiers, almost 3 full divisions, who had decided individually and collectively that they trusted him more than their own officers. The logistics were overwhelming. British forces advancing to investigate the German collapse discovered vast numbers of enemy soldiers waiting peacefully to be taken prisoner, all claiming to have surrendered to Private Whitmore. The confusion was total, but somehow the system held together. General von Steinberg, released from custody by his own guards who had joined the mass surrender, sought out Thomas as the situation stabilized. "What you have accomplished," the German general said, "is unprecedented in military history. You have convinced 3 divisions of enemy soldiers to surrender not to your army, but to you personally. They trust you to ensure their safety and proper treatment." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. Thousands of men had placed their lives in his hands, believing that his reputation for humanity would protect them from the chaos of war. The British response was swift and professional. Field Marshal Haig himself arrived to oversee the processing of what became known as the Great Surrender. Medical facilities were established to treat wounded from all sides. Prisoner processing stations were expanded to handle unprecedented numbers, and supply lines were organized to feed and shelter the surrendered troops. More importantly, the surrender had a cascading effect along the German front lines. News of the mass capitulation spread rapidly, encouraging other German units to consider similar actions. Within days, entire sections of the Western Front were experiencing localized ceasefires and surrender negotiations. Thomas found himself at the center of it all, serving as intermediary between surrendering German units and British commanders who were still struggling to understand what was happening. His reputation had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. German soldiers were actively seeking him out, believing that surrender to Der Menschliche guaranteed fair treatment. The climax came when Kaiser Wilhelm II himself, faced with the collapse of his army's morale and the mass defection of entire divisions, agreed to preliminary armistice negotiations. The war that had consumed Europe for 4 years was finally approaching its end, and Thomas Whitmore had played a crucial role in hastening that conclusion. But the story was not yet over. As armistice negotiation proceeded, scattered German units loyal to the Kaiser launched desperate attacks designed to disrupt the peace process. Thomas found himself once again in danger, targeted by German hardliners who blamed him for the army's collapse. The assassination attempt came as he was coordinating the surrender of yet another German battalion. Snipers, positioned in a ruined church, opened fire on the group of British and German officers who had gathered to formalize the capitulation. Thomas threw himself in front of General von Steinberg as bullets swept the area, taking a round in the shoulder that spun him to the ground. Around him, soldiers from both armies took cover and returned fire toward the church. As he lay bleeding in the mud, Thomas reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. What had begun as a simple message delivery had evolved into something unimaginable. He had become a bridge between enemies, a symbol of humanity in the midst of inhuman conflict. The wound was serious, but not fatal. As German and British medics worked together to treat his injury, Thomas realized that something fundamental had changed. Enemies were cooperating to save his life, recognizing in him something worth preserving despite the artificial divisions of war. Klaus Miller, the young German soldier from the earlier encounter, appeared at Thomas's side as he was being evacuated. Klaus had been among the prisoners taken during the mass surrender, but had been allowed to serve as a medic, helping with wounded from both sides. "You saved my friend Wilhelm," Klaus said in improved English learned during his captivity. "Now we save you. It is fair, yes?" Wilhelm himself appeared, walking with a pronounced limp from his treated wound, but alive and functioning. "The British doctors, they fixed my leg. Not perfect, but I can walk. I can return to Anna when this war ends." Thomas smiled despite his pain, seeing in these young men the future that his actions had helped preserve. They would return to their families, marry their sweethearts, and build lives in a world where former enemies could become friends. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m. Thomas learned of it while recovering in a British field hospital, surrounded by wounded soldiers from multiple armies who had all received the same professional medical care regardless of uniform. The war was over, but its lessons would endure. Thomas had discovered that beneath the surface of organized violence lay a deeper truth about human nature, that compassion could survive even in the most brutal circumstances, that enemies could recognize their common humanity, that individual actions could have consequences far beyond their apparent scope. In the weeks that followed, as armies began the long process of demobilization, Thomas received visitors from unexpected quarters. Former German prisoners sought him out to thank him for his treatment during their captivity. British officers credited him with saving thousands of lives through his unconventional approach to prisoner relations. Most meaningfully, he received a letter from Karl Richter, the NCO, from his first encounter in no man's land. "My dear friend Thomas, the war is over, and I am returning to my family in Bavaria. I wanted you to know that Heinrich's arm healed properly, and he has married his sweetheart. Werner survived the war and speaks often of the British soldier who showed us kindness when we expected death. We were enemies for a few years, but I hope we can be friends for the rest of our lives. If you ever come to Germany, you will always have a place at my table. Your friend, Karl." Thomas folded the letter carefully, adding it to the growing collection of correspondence from former German prisoners who had stayed in contact. Each letter represented a life saved, a family reunited, a small victory of humanity over the machinery of war. His own return to England was triumphant in ways he had never expected. Instead of the anonymous homecoming typical of enlisted men, Thomas found himself celebrated as a hero whose actions had helped end the war. Newspapers carried stories about the soldier who taught enemies to be human, and speaking requests poured in from organizations eager to hear his perspective on the conflict. But the greatest reward came on a spring morning in 1919, when Thomas stood on the platform of a London railway station waiting for a train that would bring visitors from Germany. Karl Richter had indeed come to England, accompanied by Heinrich, Wilhelm, and Klaus, the soldiers whose lives Thomas had touched during those dark nights in no man's land. The reunion was emotional beyond description. Men who had been enemies embraced as brothers, united by shared experiences that transcended national boundaries. They spoke of the war not as a glorious adventure or a patriotic duty, but as a tragedy that had nonetheless revealed the best aspects of human nature alongside the worst. "You taught us something important," Karl said as they walked through London. 4 former German soldiers and 1 British private enjoying the peace they had helped create. "You showed us that we could remain human, even in inhuman circumstances. That lesson will stay with us forever." Thomas looked at his companions, Heinrich with his carefully repaired arm, Wilhelm with his slight limp, Klaus with the wisdom that had replaced his youthful innocence, Karl with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen hell and emerged with his humanity intact. They were living proof that the war's primary lesson was not about the power of weapons or the glory of victory, but about the resilience of the human spirit. As the sun set over London, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them all to this moment. What had begun in the mud and darkness of no man's land had evolved into friendships that would last lifetimes. The war had tried to make them hate each other, but they had chosen instead to see past uniforms and nationalism to the human beings underneath. It was, Thomas realized, the most important victory of all. Years later, when historians wrote about the Great War, they would focus on battles and generals, on strategies and casualties, on the grand movements of armies across the map of Europe. But those who lived through it would remember different things. Moments of kindness between enemies, acts of courage that saved lives rather than taking them, and the discovery that humanity could survive even in the darkest circumstances. Thomas Whitmore had found his place in that history not as a killer, but as someone who helped others remember their humanity when the world seemed determined to make them forget it. It was a role he would carry with pride for the rest of his long life, knowing that sometimes, against all odds, hope could indeed bloom in the most forsaken places, and that the bonds forged in suffering could prove stronger than the hatred that had created that suffering in the first place. The trenches were forgotten, but the lessons learned in their depths would endure, carried forward by